Why did Modern Warfare 2 fail? Well, I know the exact answer, and I'm gonna expose what's going on behind the scenes. The gaming industry is undoubtedly at its roughest point ever in its near 60-year reign over the entertainment industry. And recently, there's been so much negativity within the AAA, or highest budget games scene, towards the newest releases of games, and the design choices made by big-name companies like Activision, Infinity Ward, and EA. Games have been releasing incomplete, buggy, and darn close to unplayable. And in some games, it's clear that microtransactions are the company's main goal, not entertainment. And truly, it's a sad sight to see. I could name other titles as well, but Battlefield 2042 and Cyberpunk were both full of bugs on release, and Modern Warfare 2 has absolutely no fluidity, no movement options, awfully designed maps, and contains a heavy implementation of today's topic, SBMM, or skill-based matchmaking. However, the iteration of SBMM we see in modern gaming is not actually based on skill. Not exactly. It's based on engagement. We call this EOMM, or engagement optimized matchmaking. In other words, the algorithm is built to identify what kind of lobbies are likely to keep you playing, and what lobbies will make you more likely to queue up for another game once your current one finishes. So it doesn't place you in certain lobbies based on your skill, it places you in lobbies that are tailored to keep you engaged for the longest time possible. SBMM is a convincing disguise for EOMM because it makes it look like you're being matched against people of equal skill, but if you've experienced the game, it's actually much more complex than that. For ease of explanation, I'm gonna call this system SBMM nonetheless. As I've said before, over years of successes and failures, companies have become better and better at exploiting human psychology. This system has recently become more and more prevalent. This is the main reason there's so much backlash with Call of Duty recently. Players are saying there's no place for SBMM within a casual playlist, and I agree with them 100%. But you guys know me, the story doesn't stop there. There's always the other side. There is a reason that, despite constant toxicity surrounding this decision, companies are convinced that SBMM is a good idea. This is their thought process, and keep in mind, companies only want your money and your time, nothing else. Anything they think they can do to exploit customers and make them spend more time or more money on a game, they will do it. In competitive games, or any competitive shooter, competitive meaning not just more difficult titles like Valorant, R6, CSGO, but rather any game where players play against each other, there are two types of players, casuals and competitors. People who don't care too much about the game or how good they are, and people who do care about the game and how good they are. To companies, it's extremely important to tailor their game towards both of these types of players. But the tough part is how exactly to do that. I mean, think about it. On one hand, you've got players who don't care too much, and if the game just isn't fun, or they hop on and get destroyed for too many games in a row, they will likely quit the game and dismiss it as a sweat fest or too difficult or having too big of a skill gap. We'll touch on skill gaps later, but for now, let's just keep focusing on player retention. On the sweatier side of the spectrum, it becomes much more difficult. In order to retain your more highly skilled players, you need to make sure that they are rewarded for their time investment and passion for the game. Put simply, you need to make sure there is room for the better players to excel and achieve more than the average player. I mean, after all, this is the definition of being better than average. However, there is a small problem. This doesn't rake in the top dollar, and it also doesn't encourage retention. And the reason for this is quite simply because if you were to make every lobby unadjusted and random, you'll see a mix of bad and good players within a lobby. On average, the spread will look like this. This is just an estimate though. Assuming it's a standard 6 versus 6 COD lobby, each team will on average have one amazing player, 4 average players whose skill level varies slightly, and 1 player who is just terrible. This is assuming that SBMM is not in place. This lobby is randomly and fairly created. However, what is obvious is that the more highly skilled players on either team will do the best in these lobbies. Based on how good they are, it might be absolute destruction, or they might just perform well in top frag. Either way, this is super fun for them, and they will stay engaged in having fun across multiple matches, maybe even for hours on end. However, assuming every match is like this, Activision thinks that the average and below average players will quickly become discouraged and quick to call the game a sweatfest and label it as far too difficult. Given these players do not care about their skill level, or even about the game really, they likely will have no problem giving up the game and just playing a more appealing title. After all, it isn't fun for them and they don't care enough to spend hours in the game to improve just so they can have fun, so why would they stick around? And this is the core problem to these companies. The type of player I just described, the average casual, and those who are worse than average, make up a huge majority of the player base. This is what I found by observing the general consensus about COD's player base. However, I'm going to be really generous and say that the player base is 70% casual and 30% competitive, even though the split is more like 90-10. The combined percentages of the average and below average players far outweighs the passionate tryhard players, or even the players that are a little above average. And so when companies start to think that the top 30% are scaring away the other 70%, it is clear that something needs to be done about it. But what? Well, these companies have a few options. What Modern Warfare 2 did, although I hate their guts for it, to them was not a bad idea. This idea was to close the skill gap. First, they evaluated what makes a good player good. There is a certain hypothetical ladder that you have to climb in order to be recognized as a great player. This is just my observation, but good players have 4 general elements that make them stand out: aim, game sense, movement, and positioning. To continue this thought, you may have heard of a skill ceiling or skill gap. These are both important terms to understand the implementation of SBMM. The skill ceiling of a game is the absolute maximum fathomable skill a player can have in a game at a certain point. Most of the huge meta-changing breakthroughs in games have been from players shattering what most perceive to be the skill ceiling, much like Zen, the Rocket League player who is virtually unbeatable right now, or back in the day when Mongrel pushed the boundaries of Fortnite's building and editing. A skill gap in a game is how much difference is between a good player and a bad player. The larger the skill gap, generally the more difficult the game is to excel at, and the more time it requires to become an excellent player. Generally, the skill ceiling and skill gap of a game are directly related, meaning the higher the skill ceiling, the higher the skill gap. A game like Fortnite has a ludicrously high skill ceiling and skill gap. Comparing a noob and a pro is like night and day. Same with games like Valorant, CSGO, heck, even chess. If you put a bad or average player against a highly skilled player in these kinds of games, they do not stand a single chance. They will undoubtedly be demolished because the mechanics that the better player has a better command of completely overpower the basic mechanics that the new player is still grasping. However, take games like COD, Among Us, Fall Guys, or any other more arcade style game. The skill gap is not as severe. Average players will still be able to kill good players and win, but not as much. But due to certain factors that are random, much easier game mechanics like COD's simple point and shoot idea, and with a little luck on their side, they can still succeed a reasonable amount of the time. A perfect example is COD's notorious COD timing. A good player expects someone to come through a certain angle and does their due diligence to pre-aim and anticipate it, then turns away and gets melted from the same angle the instant they do. These unlucky incidents are pretty unavoidable, and these RNG elements are what makes games more accessible and tolerable for newer players, because they can actually experience some form of success within it. What Activision has done is close the skill gap as much as they possibly can. They've removed all forms of advanced movement techniques like bunny hopping and slide canceling, made weird and convoluted maps that have too many open sight lines, too many buildings, and too many weird angles to be shot from, and weird places to camp in, which makes good positioning very difficult. They buffed controller aim assist to make it less difficult to hit your target for less skilled players, and based on their patents, they also manipulate health, damage, and hitboxes, and we also suspect they're manipulating audio. All of these things they have added suffocate more highly skilled players and worsen their performance by punishing everything that makes them good. Hardcore sweats hate them for this, and hilariously, even casuals hate these changes. Needless to say, this backfired horrendously, because all it does is slow the game down, and Call of Duty is notorious for its fast-paced gunplay, and when that's removed, even casual fans start to lose interest. But here is the ultimate catch. Even if they do everything to appeal to casuals and below average players, they can't just only do this, because they're sacrificing 30% of their player base that are sweaty players, and they can't have that. But in their eyes, you can't satisfy both parties, even though in my opinion you can without any shady methods, but these big corporations beg to differ. So they have to resort to more manipulative means. Enter SBMM, or EOMM disguised as SBMM. The number one thing you have to realize with skill-based matchmaking is that the company is not implementing this to create fair matches. That is the last thing they want to do. It is not about fairness. They are implementing it for two far more evil reasons. First, they want to make bad players think they're better than they are. And second, they want to make it impossible for good players to evaluate their current skill level and improvement. They do this by keeping everyone's kill-death ratio as close to a 1 as possible. And keep in mind, everything I say in this next section is not how these events factually played out in the lifespan of Modern Warfare 2. It's rather what Activision thought would happen, and their thought process of how to quote-unquote fix this situation. Alright, that being said, here we go. If casual players are bad or average, but they perform well anyways, they will stay playing the game. It's that simple. There's no logical reason for them to quit if they want to play and they enjoy the game. What this algorithm essentially does is takes their performance and purposely puts them in lobbies where they will perform well, and they won't be overly aggravated with getting killed too much by sweaty players, and not bored enough playing against literal 3-year-olds with no headset. It's an experience that is perfectly tailored to keep these players engaged, despite their mediocre performance. If they have a bad game, the algorithm will make sure they do better in the next one, because the company does not want to lose players. On the flip side, more skilled players care more about performing above average, usually pushing a KD ratio at least higher than a 1.5, and they care about getting better. Companies have two choices when it comes to dealing with this kind of player. Let's analyze both. First, they could just make sure that if a player has high amounts of skill, they're in lobbies that they will dominate a high percentage of the time. If they constantly see that they're the best player in every lobby, they will never quit playing. However, this methodology is dangerous, as it puts them at risk of casual players quitting because they're getting wrecked by sweatier players most of their games. So they take option 2, make it impossible for sweaty players to evaluate their skill level and progress. This is done brilliantly, but despicably, by the main culprit, Activision. Basically, if a good player has a good game, 9 times out of 10 they will have a much tougher time performing at that level in their next match. But why? Basically, they want them to say, I did really well last game and I saw improvement, but now I'm getting destroyed. How much better did I really get? Did I even get better? Or was I just lucky? Or were those guys just bad? And then subconsciously their brain says, I guess I gotta play more to find out. And then this gets them trapped in a cycle of constantly doing bad, then good, then fantastic, then terrible. It's manipulative and plain wrong in my opinion. But this is what covers Activision's front and back. Their bad players think they're better than they actually are because they're put in lobbies where their KD is fairly even, and maybe shady patented software may or may not assist them in that, which makes them stay playing. And good players are left questioning their own improvement because their performance across games is a roller coaster. This is by design. Skill-based matchmaking is not to establish fairness and balanced lobbies. It's to manipulate people into playing more by creating a false and artificial environment in which these different types of players play. They knock out 2 birds with 1 stone, 2 player types with 1 algorithm. Once again, this appears as genius, but it's extremely unfair. But what if I told you that despite making sense on paper, the system doesn't actually work in the first place? Let me repeat myself. Everything I said in that section to explain the implementation of heavy skill-based matchmaking was from the perspective of large corporations. They think they will retain more players and keep their casual players playing if they close the skill gap, make the game slower, and make the matchmaking work in a way they think will keep players engaged. But hilariously, this system does not work at all. In fact, it kills player engagement. Heavy skill-based matchmaking, or heavy engagement optimized matchmaking, has caused more highly skilled players to quit, and closing the skill gap and adding slow, campy maps has made even the baseline casual experience not entertaining at all. It completely backfired on Activision, and their numbers are down to a record low. Heck, even PUBG has more players than them, and PUBG is a great game, don't get me wrong, but it should not be beating out the most popular shooter in the world. The question is, how do we sort out this problem in a morally right and more logical way, and in a way that actually works? I mean, the problem is still there. If casuals get wrecked by sweats too much, they will quit, right? If a sweaty player is constantly sweating in tournament mode whenever they're just trying to play casual playlists, they will quit. So how do we solve this problem? Well, the solution is, at least in my opinion, and it won't surprise you, we don't fix it. Mixed lobbies were never ever a problem, and the system is a failed attempt at trying to take in even more numbers than games like COD were before. It's fixing something that's not broken, and trying to push numbers that don't need to be pushed, and artificially closing the skill gap, implementing this shady version of EOMM, and using suspicious patented software to manipulate player performance. COD is in its worst state and losing the most players ever, especially by slowing the pace of the game down by restricting movement and making larger, campier maps. They haven't just made the game boring for better players, they've made it boring for everyone. To conclude, my only hope is that companies will start realizing that games are made for people to genuinely enjoy, and they're created out of passion for games, and not out of the desire to make the most amount of money. People are starting to wake up to the amount of manipulation that modern games contain, and unless these companies can shape up and be more genuine and listen to their communities, the AAA industry is going to continue losing fans and players. Before I go, I just want to thank you guys hugely for the awesome reception on my Modern Warfare 2 video. I just want to bring those patterns to light, and I thank you guys for your supportive comments and everything else, and even comments that disagree with me. I never come at anyone with hostility. I just want to hear everyone's opinion and make sure that the truth is brought to light. But until next time, that's all I got. Take it easy.